Hey guys, my name is Colson Rosa, and welcome back to Seraphim Stories. So today I wanted to talk to you guys about editing, and I know how challenging that editing can be, and just a lot of difficulties that can come with it. Hopefully this lesson will make it a little bit easier for you guys to edit your stories. Now I know a lot of you have requested a book on self-publishing and how I was able to go through that journey to get my book self-published. But I wanted to release this video first just to talk to you guys about the editing that needs to take place before you reach that point where you're ready to self-publish your book. Editing is a skill that any author needs to learn, whether they're at the start of their journey or at the end, finishing up a book, wrapping it up, getting it ready for release. So I wanted to talk to you guys about some of the key traits of editing that some people realize, but a lot of people don't, especially when it comes to looking at the entirety of your story and taking multiple edits to do what needs to be done both for its structure and for its grammar. So this is going to take time and effort, and editing can be quite a long process. Usually when I'm writing a book, it'll take me about half to 3/4 of a year to write a book, and then half to 3/4 of a year to edit a book. So writing a full-length novel, especially when you're new, isn't something that's easy, but you don't have to start there. Even if you're just starting with a short story, that needs to be edited and refined as well to make it the best it possibly could be. So the first tip I want to give you guys is to do a story overview, to read through your entire story and see how does the story flow and progress. Take it almost as if you're the reader, trying to imagine this entire tale from its beginning to its end. Is it gripping? Does it move you? Is it maybe too short or too long? Does it match the concepts we've talked about previously when it comes to plot, characters, setting, tension, and fictional novels as a whole? How is everything built up? Is the climax riveting? And then how is the resolution satisfying for your reader? Taking this sort of bird's eye approach where you look at your entire novel can help you see its progression, and you don't have to get too bogged down into the details yet. Just read through the entire story. And you even could have someone else read through the entire story so you could get a second opinion and maybe catch some things that you might have missed. Now the next type of editing is scene by scene, going through each specific scene, and now you have, since you've read through your entire story, an idea of where that scene sits in the greater narrative. Why do I have this scene? That's a great question to ask. What is it adding to the development of the story? How did it come out? Are you happy with the final result of that scene? Look to improve it. Every scene can be improved in some ways. Few scenes, especially after your rough draft, are perfectly polished and finished the way they need to be. What did you leave out of this scene and why? What maybe should you have added to the scene to have given it more depth or more intrigue or more emotion? What were some of your hardest scenes to write? Now when you're writing your rough draft, you can keep a mental note of some of the scenes that challenged you the most. Those scenes may need some extra time of refinement, where you can look at them and try to get a grip on what really made them so challenging, and are you happy with how it turned out, or did you just have to put pen to paper to get something down? And you might need to spend more time there, but even with some of the scenes you're happiest with, don't just assume that they're perfect from the beginning. The third type of editing you might need to do is for plot holes. Assume that there are at least a couple of plot holes in your story. You shouldn't automatically assume just because you did a plot line that you caught every potential inconsistency. This could be an inconsistency with character motives and actions, with parts of the plot that just don't make sense together. Maybe your character already seems to have known something he or she never could have known at this point in the story. Or maybe there's just plot holes about people being at the right or wrong place at the right or wrong time. There are lots of different plot holes that occur. And you need to be a detective of sorts, going through your story, trying to figure out if all the pieces fit together. And then, if you find a few, you need to have a proper method to solve them. To say, okay, this part of the story doesn't make sense. Because, let's say, for example, they win a battle but never use their greatest weapon in it. You might say, well, how were they able to win without this weapon that I built up? Or maybe if they lose the battle, but they had a weapon they could have used and didn't, why didn't they use it? You need to be able to quickly problem solve. And not quickly in the sense of just rushing to find an answer, but quickly in the sense of being able to know each problem, find a solution to each problem, and do this for many different problems, because your story is likely to have more than one inconsistency, and that's okay. But you need to not get too bogged down by those inconsistencies, but find a way to rise above them and push through them. And this, once again, is where a second pair of eyes can be incredibly helpful. I know my editor, who's done just such an amazing job helping me with these stories, has really pushed me to find inconsistencies that she's seen that maybe I never would have seen, or parts of the story that were really confusing for her as a reader of my book that in my mind I didn't view as confusing. And this is something that I think is really important for an author to recognize. They are so immersed in their own story. They have such a clear mental picture of everything that's happening. They've been spending months on this novel or on this short story that it just comes naturally to them. So they might have biases toward parts of their story that a reader doesn't have, and a reader isn't as naturally committed to this world and doesn't quite understand it as easily as the author would, just because they've been so engrossed and developed by this story. So the next part of editing I want to talk about is character arcs. Like we've talked about in my previous video on characters, there needs to be a progression. Characters need to be cared about deeply, whether for positive or negative reasons. It's usually not helpful if you have a character that the reader sort of feels no emotions toward. Sort of dull, sort of uninteresting. You would rather your reader hate a character than be bored by a character. You would rather your reader love a character than have no feelings toward a character at all. You want to have an arc for a character that progresses them, or if they're not progressed, how do the characters that do progress, maybe learning new life skills or accomplishing great feats they've always wanted to accomplish, how do they react to that person who's stuck in the mud and hasn't changed for the better or for the worse? It could be someone who's stuck to their morals and refused to ever let them be changed. Or it could be someone who's selfish or just stubborn, and the fact that they didn't change hurts a lot of your other characters. But you need to look at your characters from a whole and say, are you satisfied with where they began versus where they ended? Have they matured throughout the journey? Have they come to realize more things about themselves, about the world around them, or about their friends and their family because of what has taken place? And this needs to be not only deeply felt by the reader, but it should be deeply felt by the characters. The characters themselves can almost realize the progress that has been made. Now, sometimes they're oblivious to it, especially if the main characters are children. They might not realize a lot of the steps that they've taken. But more often than not, you'd be surprised how many characters can look back on what they've gone through and just be shocked and amazed. I think of the Lord of the Rings series, where with all that they went through, at the very end of the book, Sam and Frodo can look back on their entire journey through so many different lands, eventually reaching Mount Doom itself and destroying the ring. And just consider, how did we get this far? They were sort of happy and carefree at the start in the Fellowship of the Ring. But then they had to go through some of the hardest acts they've ever had to do, some of the hardest times they've ever had to face. And then when Frodo finally departs, Sam can just cry tears over him and the friendship and the bond that they built, and they will always remember those moments for the rest of their lives. So the next part of editing I want to talk about ties directly in with this, ties directly in with that progression of the characters and the stakes that they felt in their lives. And it's, does it make sense? Does the story itself make sense to the reader? Are these emotions felt by the reader? Do they sympathize or empathize with everything that's being expressed? And you want your reader to feel at ease reading a scene, that it's easy for them to understand, or if it's difficult for them to understand, that you give them hints or clues, or maybe a character who's explaining some things that's happening so that they're not overwhelmed by a scene. You need to almost step back from your work. I know it's precious to you, and my books were definitely precious to me, but you need to say, if I was a brand new reader coming at this story, what would I find annoying or strange about it? What would I find really interesting or informative or maybe inspirational? And a second set of eyes is so helpful here. Having a friend that you trust, or maybe someone who's read some of the other books if you're writing a series, who can give you honest feedback about if the dialogue is natural or sounds kind of stuffy, if you've used economy of words and gotten right to the point, or if you've just kind of lingered and drawn on the same scene over and over and over. And you want your reader to be honest with you, because that's the honest opinion that so many other people may have when they approach the book. And you don't have to be a perfectionist. You don't have to say every single word has to be the perfect word or I'll never accept this book. But you do want to try to find the flaws and refine them and polish them, because without that, there's going to be mistakes that you've made that then remain into the final project. And this could be everything from action scenes that are too developed or too simple, victories too easily won, or not enough victories won so that the reader feels depressed. But overall, you want the storyline that you've presented to make sense, to be clear and resonating, and to have a real emotional punch, an emotional weight to it that someone can really feel. So now the last kind of editing is sort of different from the rest of these. I've been talking mostly about your story and your characters and your plot itself in sort of a large scale approach. But this other kind of editing is just as crucial, but it's much more in the nitty gritty. I'm talking about English and grammar. Reading your story aloud is one great way to help catch mistakes that come in your English and your grammar. This is a skill you're going to develop over time. No one just automatically understands the rules of English and grammar perfectly, and that's okay. But you're going to continue to work at it. You're going to continue to build your refinement and your understanding of misspelled words, capitalization, punctuation, a lot of these things that you need to know. And you need to learn the skill. You need to look beyond autocorrect, because autocorrect is not a crutch you can always rely upon. I know, especially with Microsoft Word, autocorrect can help sometimes, but there's a lot of mistakes it makes, and a lot of other mistakes it just simply does not catch. It thinks the sentence is fine when in reality it's not. And finding someone who has additional experience in this field, who can help you edit your books and who can teach you a lot of these skills, is a valuable asset for you to have. I think that's exactly what my editor is for me. She has a lot of awareness when it comes to English and grammar. And she's been training me and making notes for me and teaching me more and more about what it means for me to even understand correct and incorrect sentence structure, and grammar. Expect to have errors in this situation. Just because there's no blue or red underlines from your Microsoft Word application or whatever software you choose to use doesn't mean that there's no English and grammar mistakes. Even after you've edited through your entire story once for English and grammar mistakes, there probably will still be some. So it can be beneficial to then go through your story again, maybe read it aloud again, or look specifically in areas that had a lot of mistakes. Essentially, you need to fact check your fact checking. You need to make sure that you double check every sentence. And I know that sounds like a drain, but in the end, it's going to make so much more of a polished outcome you can be proud of. Because we've all seen it before, where you're reading through even professional documents put out by companies that have grammatical errors in them, and you start to seriously doubt if this was made by a professional or not. Now, that's not to say if there are a couple of mistakes that your work is ruined or it's worthless. It is to say, however, that the more can be avoided, the better. And the more you can find those small mistakes, you don't want them to add up into big mistakes. A couple of minor English or grammar mistakes won't ruin a book. But if you have many of them, they will start to add upon each other so that there's a higher likelihood the reader notices and a higher likelihood the reader starts to care. Because the more that the reader sees, the more they're going to start to care about the strange mistakes made in both English and grammar. But take heart, especially if this is the first book that you're writing, because it doesn't have to be perfect from the start. As deeply as I love The Knights of Turin, I recognize that I wrote it originally when I was 12 years old. Now, I went back when I was 14 and did a second edition to add a lot of pages of depth to it, to refine it. Even then, I still recognize that it has some mistakes. It's not a perfect book, and that's something I'm okay to live with because it shows my progression as a writer. As you go through the Tales of Amquino series, you're going to start seeing improvements from the first book to the second, from the second to the third, from the third to the fourth, on and on. And that's something I'm really proud of, is to see the growth. That's something I can hang my hat on when I look back at my series. Now, that being said, I tried to the best of my ability, refine even the Knights of Turin to get it to the best place it could be. And I think I was mostly successful in doing that, even though there are some minor story threads that I wish I had clarified more about, or some minor English and grammar mistakes, though I think we've removed most of them. Now, I want to say that too, just to say that looking back, even at this first book, even though it's not quite as long or quite as developed in some senses as some of my other books, I do think I applied a lot of these characteristics we've talked about with story, with setting, with plot. And that's why I'm always going to still recommend this first book in my series as one that readers should go to. Because not only does it start off the adventure, but it really just cements the beginning of this world. And that's something that I'll always remain optimistic about and encouraged by. So I hope you're encouraged as well to not let editing slow you down, but to let it be something that you can use even to refine your own craft as a writer. Editing challenges you and pushes you to make you better at the world of storytelling in so many different ways. And that is actually very exciting. So thank you guys so much for listening to the video. I hope this really helps and encourages you in the world of editing. And like I said, I'm hoping to release here in the next few weeks a video on self-publishing as well, which will be a very similar idea of how to expand into that world of finishing your books and getting them out for the world to see. So thank you guys so much. I hope you loved the video. Please consider subscribing or liking this video if you could, just to help support me. And have a great day, guys. God bless.